welcome once again. I'm Imran Garda and you're in the stream. Today, while putting a price on pollution, reduce carbon emissions, we look at the ongoing debate over Australia's carbon tax. Filling in again for Ahmed is Malika Bilal. We'll be looking out for all your live feedback. Hey Malika.
Hi, good to be here.
Well, with her on the couch is Nathan Richardson, who's an attorney and scholar at Resources for the Future, a non-profit organization that researches environmental policies. Nathan, tell us what you're currently working on.
Sure. I'm an attorney, like you said. I work on the environmental and climate policy here in the United States, particularly on how and whether markets can be used to make that policy work better. Right now, I'm trying to work on whether that policy can be connected to other countries, or we're going to have a policy in this country that could have those international connections.
Difficult to introduce markets into the debate when you have people rejecting that the climate is changing at all.
That's certainly true. You know, as we were talking about before, I think you're always going to have a core of people that reject whether the climate is changing, and you're not going to get those people on board with any climate policy, however cost-effective or not cost-effective it is. But the majority of people in this country think that the climate's changing, that humans are behind it, and that the government should do something about it. And the question is just what? That's where you get the disagreement. But that's also where you can have an interesting conversation.
Yeah, well, we are going to have an interesting conversation focused on Australia. Look forward to your thoughts as you chime in over that throughout the duration of the program. Well, as always, we look forward to your thoughts too. You can tell us what stories matter to you. Follow us on Twitter and send a tweet with the hashtag AJStream. We look forward to hearing your suggestions on topics for future episodes.
On Thursday, we covered the ongoing development projects taking place in the Muslim holy city of Mecca, and your comments are still coming in. Two of our guests were critical of the expansion process that has destroyed religious and historical sites in the city. We'd like to mention we had reached out to numerous contractors and Saudi government officials who supported the methodology of the expansion, but either were unavailable or refused to come on the show. Now here's some of what you had to say about the story. There's no cost, only benefits, writes Sami Garba on our Facebook page. The benefit of Mecca's expansion is spiritual upliftment. Muslims are happy with the expansion. But Asma, another Facebook user, writes, the expansion is only bringing more rich-poor disparity. Well, let us know what you think, and your feedback could end up in a future show. We've also been following your calls for coverage of the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, which celebrates its 20th anniversary of independence Tuesday. To coincide with the date, the UK-based human rights group Amnesty International has launched an online campaign urging the release of an activist who called for anti-government protests. Amnesty tweets, Azerbaijan is 20 tomorrow. Call on the president to free 20-year-old Jazeera Savalan, jailed for a Facebook post. Now, the group says Savalan was arrested on what it calls trumped-up drug charges a day after calling for protests via Facebook in February. The government has defended the ruling, but Amnesty is encouraging Twitter users to send a message to President Ilham Aliyev's official Twitter account, @PresidentAZ, to call for Savalan's release. The Twitter campaign also extended to the UK Foreign Office. After a flurry of retweets from around the world, the Foreign Office responded, tweeting, thanks for all your Jazeera Savalan messages. We regularly raise human rights with Azerbaijan and will continue to do so. If you're following the Free Jazeera campaign, we want to hear your thoughts, so tweet us at AJStream.
Hi, my name is Mariam Al-Khawaja. I'm a human rights activist from Bahrain, and I'm in the stream.
Now, Australia's plan for a national carbon tax awaits final approval by the Senate next month. The pollution tax would apply to about 500 of Australia's biggest carbon emitters and would eventually move to a carbon trading system in 2015. For more, let's take a look at this video from the Australian government trying to convince people why this is a good idea. Let's have a look.
Changes this. Instead of being able to pollute for free, big polluters must pay a price for every tonne of carbon pollution they create.
Industry must factor in the cost of carbon pollution in their business, just as they factor in materials and labour. This will have two impacts. One, it will drive businesses to find new ways to reduce pollution. Two, it will make goods and services which are produced with lots of energy more expensive.
Households will notice this change through rising costs in some goods and services, but the overall impact on prices will be small. 9 in 10 households will receive a combination of tax cuts and increased payments to help them with the cost of living.
Okay, so that's the sales pitch from the Australian government. But of course, critics of the plan say carbon taxing will result in major job losses and increased energy prices for Australians. Of course, the long-term goal is meant to help the environment, but will pricing pollution actually reduce those harmful carbon emissions, which is of course the whole point of this? Well, joining us now to help explain this is Jeremy Moss, Professor and Director of the Social Justice Initiative at the University of Melbourne, where he focuses on issues of climate justice. Also from DC, we have Tim Andrews, who's the Managing Editor of Menzies House, an Australian online community for conservative and libertarian thinkers. Tim is also a contributor to the website stopgillardscarbontax.com. Tim and Jeremy, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the stream. Tim, given the website name, I'm presuming that you're not too happy with this proposal. Tell us why it's not the right idea.
Look, that's correct, and thank you for having me on the show. The fact of the matter is that Julia Gillard went to the Australian people before the last election promising flat out, quote, there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. She and the rest of her government went out repeatedly before the last election, rejecting that they would do this flat out, and they breached their commitment to the Australian people by, as soon as winning the election, introducing this carbon tax. This carbon tax, which is one of the biggest and steepest in the world, is one which will have severe detrimental effect on the Australian economy. It is something that will cost Australians jobs. It is something that will force every household to increase budgets to suffer. And most importantly, it's not something that will help the environment. Australia produces less than 1.5% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and it is completely unfeasible to suggest that Australia should have one of the most draconian carbon taxes in the world, a tax which isn't supported by any
But Tim, the government says there are going to be big subsidies for the businesses that are affected, for the taxpayers, so they're not really going to feel the economic pinch.
And this is a ridiculous argument because of the simple fact that how can you say that the entire point is to change behaviour on one hand, and then on the other hand say, well, we're going to give them subsidies so that they're not going to feel the pain. This is an utterly ridiculous argument. The fact of the matter is that even under the incredibly optimistic modelling of the Australian Treasury, which is incredibly optimistic for a number of reasons, this tax will cost the economy $1 trillion by 2050. This is a tax that will increase the size and scope of government. And sure, there might be some churning going on where the government takes some money, redistributes welfare, and distributes it as welfare in the case of corporate subsidies. Sure, this will have some effect, but that's bad in and of itself.
Okay,
the redistributing, churning factor is bad, and most importantly, it won't compensate everyone.
Okay.
There are thousands of businesses, especially small businesses, the real job creators in Australia, who are already feeling the pinch, who won't get this compensation, and will be faced with, just one small thing. A small business in New South Wales, independent modelling showed, will pay up to $4,000 in increased electricity bills.
Okay.
I mean, these are the costs.
Okay, let's get Jeremy in now. Jeremy, Tim saying that Australia only emits 1.5% of global emissions, that this is a bad idea, and he has an economic argument here. He's saying this is going to be bad for Australian taxpayers and all Australians because economically it's disastrous. What do you think?
Well, look, a couple of points on that. It's true that Australia only emits 1.5% of global emissions, but I mean, we can hardly be in the position of tackling global warming and asking other countries such as China and India to cut their own emissions if we do nothing ourselves. So I think that's completely impracticable. And furthermore, I think it's morally wrong that we should ask other countries to do something to perhaps make some sacrifices when we're unwilling to do so ourselves, especially as Australia is, in world terms, an extremely wealthy nation and can well afford to do this. The economists I've spoken to and who've published on this matter say it's going to increase prices by less than 1% because of the tax, which I think is a very small amount indeed. As has been pointed out, 9 out of 10 households will be compensated for the impact of the tax on their household budgets. And really what matters is that the worst off people are compensated, and I think they are compensated under this package. What I would say, though, is in small agreement with Tim here, is there is, I think, too much of a focus on compensating businesses, particularly large businesses, under this tax. 40% of the tax goes to businesses, and I think that 40%, or at least a part of it, would be better off being spent on alternative technologies or energy-saving measures or other things like that that would actually reduce the carbon in an effective way.
Okay, let's bring Nathan in. Nathan, your thoughts thus far?
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting debate, and I mean, I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, I mean, so much of the money that's coming from the tax ends up being redistributed either back to businesses or back to households, and it sounds like actually, and this is something that you guys touched on, that was something that you almost disagreed in the sense that wasn't such a great idea. I mean, there's no free lunch here. You're kind of both on board with that, and what you really want to do with the carbon policy is create incentives for change to happen. So I guess my question is there really agreement here or not? Okay,
who's that? Let's start with Jeremy, and then we'll get Tim as well. Jeremy?
Well, I suspect if you scratch the surface, there's probably not a lot of agreement. But look, I don't have a problem with redistribution per se. I think pollutants are being pumped into the atmosphere, and they have to be paid for. There's no such thing as a free lunch in that sense. What's happening at the moment is that businesses and all of us are getting a free ride on the environment. And what's more, on the effects that the pollution is causing on people in our own countries and in countries other than Australia. And that has to be paid for. So that's, I think, the important sense in which there's no such thing as a free lunch. I actually think that the poor should be compensated because of the effects of the carbon price. But I think probably it shouldn't be done via the revenue-raising mechanisms of the carbon tax. It should be done through the tax system. I would prefer to see the bulk of the money actually going to cut pollution, because as it stands, Australia will be emitting more CO2 in 2020 than it is now by 40 or so million tonnes.
But that's a strong point. Can I just take that and actually throw it to Tim, because that's a compelling argument in and of itself. Australia will be polluting far more by 2020. You spoke about Australia only being 1.5% of global emissions. However, per capita, you're one of the top 5 in the world. You're a small country. With all of that in mind, something needs to be done. You may disagree perhaps with the nuance of it, but something really needs to be addressed. And Julia Gillard is addressing it, isn't she?
There are a couple of things in response to that. Firstly, Australians' emission of carbon dioxide is domestically comparable with where we are in the world, according to our GDP and our standard of living. And I want to point this out, that I don't like using the term carbon pollution, because pollution has these connotations, which is why the government chose it, of black soot coming out of factory smokestacks. Whereas in effect, carbon dioxide is a colourless, odourless DAX, which is necessary for plant growth and so forth. With that being said, assuming there is this problem, and we haven't touched on the science yet, but assuming that there is a need to cut emissions, there is a simple way of doing this, which has been the time-tested way throughout history, and that is, rather than having big government impositions, rather than having big government redistributing wealth, and this is where I think I strongly disagree with Jeremy, because Jeremy said he favours redistribution as a concept, whereas I would say the best way to achieve success is through technological change, which is driven by the free market. For hundreds of years, we have shown, proven, demonstrated in every instance that the free market is what drives technology, and it's the free market and not big government where we need to.
But the free market doesn't take the environment into account. So I mean, I think
that's not the case at all. And I think that what we've seen is the more prosperous a country is, the more it can afford to worry about the environment. The fact that Jeremy says we're a wealthy country, and so we need to act first as opposed to China and India. Well, the argument there is we're a wealthy country because we have had a free market. Okay. And now we're in a position to start to worry about these sorts of things. Okay. And so rather than imposing these costs now, if we let the free market flourish, then industries will have, and and companies will have greater resources to be able to finance new technologies, who will be able to find clean, effective, green alternative technologies which don't currently exist. That's what we need to invest in the future. That's the only way this has worked historically, and that's the only way in future for Australia to move forward.
Okay,
and this is why every single opinion poll has shown that an overwhelming majority of Australians strongly oppose the government.
That's a fair point, because a Nielsen poll says that 56% of the public are against the tax. That's the most recent Nielsen poll in Australia. Malika's dipping into the feedback that we're generating over this topic.
Right, and I'd like to jump in here with a question posed to Jeremy. Someone tweets, David Spencer, his name is, environmental problem converted into an economic one for those who can't see the former for the latter. And there's also a Facebook post here from someone named Blair Purvis who says, this is an initiative that Australia can be proud of. A Robin Hood tax, taking from the polluters and giving to the poor with huge tax breaks being offered. Time will tell if it makes a positive impact on the environment. So the question is, we're talking about the economic benefits or problems, but what is the benefit for the environment? How will this help?
Well, look, I would say that actually the problem with the tax is not there's too much of it, but there's too little. At $23 a tonne, what's going to happen, I think, is that it'll phase out some of the less economically feasible coal-fired electricity plants. But what will happen is that they'll be replaced with gas, for instance. And I think Australia, unless there's a really concerted and strong push towards renewable technology, will still be locked into a fossil fuel generating energy future. And I think that's probably a bad thing. But look, I could just make one comment on this, on Tim's comment about the free market. There's no such thing as a free market. Markets are always regulated. It's just the degree to which they're regulated. And I think that in this case, this is a strong case for regulation in the public good. I think that the idea that the free market will just deliver all these benefits in the very short time we have to deliver them is just lunacy, really. And to think that we're going to get a significant cut in our emissions by 2020, which is when we need them, via free markets is just not feasible. Okay. New technologies need to be supported, they need to be encouraged, and at the moment, the only way that can happen is via government intervention. Okay,
there's a TV ad running at the moment in Australia, and it's also available on YouTube. It's called Get Carbon Policy Right. Let me play you a little snippet of it. We'll play a segment of it because obviously it's very weighted towards those who oppose it, and then we'll discuss afterwards. Have a watch.
If Australia produces less than 1.5% of global carbon emissions...
Why are we paying the world's biggest carbon tax?
Why should our electricity bills nearly double?
In our schools.
In our hospitals.
In our homes.
In our shops.
In small businesses.
And on our farms.
Why are we racing ahead with the carbon tax?
When a lot of the world is backing away.
Why should we pay the world's biggest carbon tax?
If it makes no difference to climate change.
Why, when the global economy is so weak?
Why should our country lose billions in exports?
Why should we have to pay more for public transport?
Why should I have to pay more for groceries?
No other country's paying this much.
Why are we paying the world's biggest carbon tax?
If it makes no difference to climate change.
So basically, why are we paying, you heard it, why are we paying the biggest carbon tax if it makes no difference to climate change? There's a strong lobby, as we're hearing, of those against this policy. Tim, you're against it. I mean, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is that this isn't the biggest carbon tax. 23 Australian dollars, 25 US dollars. This isn't the biggest in the world by a long stretch. Sweden taxes, I think, 150 US dollars per tonne. So this isn't the biggest by a long, long way. Isn't that a myth that's being perpetuated?
I stated it is one of the biggest. I'm not sure about that particular advertisement. I mean, and it is one of the biggest. I think it's the second. But either way, it is one of the biggest. But look, Mike, what that ad really raises is that it won't do anything to raise the environment. And I have a question for Jeremy here, a two-part question. Jeremy, you said that you think this tax isn't big enough. So my questions are, one, can you tell me in 100 years what impact this tax would have on the environment, as stated? And secondly, And what do you think it doesn't go far enough? What carbon price do you think Australia should see? Because obviously we're opposed to this because we think it's too big. And if you don't think it's going far enough, then I think we probably agree that as it stands, it will have no environmental impact.
Okay.
So what do you think? I mean, can you tell me what this tax will actually achieve for the environment?
Okay, that's quite a bit for Jeremy to chew over. Jeremy, go ahead.
Look, I think that in this context, we shouldn't just be talking about a tax. So I think that the tax should be higher to offer a real incentive for electricity companies and so forth to swap from, not just to swap from coal to gas, but from coal to renewable energy forms of generation. So I think it needs to be high enough for that to occur. And secondly, why I think that the tax is probably not as useful as it could be is I think that a tax by itself is not enough. We actually need targets. We actually need to say that by a certain date, say 2020, we need to reduce our emissions by not 5%, but 40%. 40%, a really large reduction. And I think we need to do things to achieve that, such as investing in infrastructure, public transport, and so on, energy saving measures. We need to do a whole range of things to kickstart our reduction of CO2 emissions. As to what will happen in 100 years, well, it's hard to say the effect that this tax will have in 100 years. But what we do know for certain is that if we don't do anything, what will happen in 100 years is that we'll be paying a lot more than we are now for the environmental problems caused by CO2 emissions, and that the world will be a very dangerous place to live.
Okay, that's Jeremy's wish list. Nathan, do you agree with him?
I mean, I think I don't know if he's right about whether the size of the tax Australia is putting into place being right. I really don't have a particular perspective on that, but I do think it's the right move to have one. I mean, I guess I would take what Jeremy said and throw it back towards Tim. I mean, Tim talked about how it's important to have a free market to address these problems, and even if we agree with that completely, I look at the debates that happened in this country over environmental policy over the past 20 years, and people on the right that started out opposing environmental policy said, look, we need markets to solve these problems. And they came up with some great ideas. They came up with cap and trade. They came up with carbon tax or pollution taxing. And there was a time when Greens would say, no, we don't want that. That's unacceptable. And now for opponents of environmental regulation to say that we can't have those either, it seems to Greens like the goalposts have moved. And I think Imran made a point earlier. When you emit carbon, you are causing costs, and those aren't in the market. Economists would call it an externality. My colleagues, lawyers, would call it a nuisance. In either case, you need to pay, or there's not an adequate measure. And if you're opposing this regulation and you say you need markets to do it, what about the opponent? What about the right to own ideas on this? Why reject them now when they were your own best ideas 10 years ago?
Tim, I know you want to answer, and this was directed towards you, but we have run out of time. So we're going to save this for the post show because we've got still about 10 minutes of discussion left in the post show, but we've got to wrap it up for now on the actual TV show. So keep that in mind and mull over it for another 30 seconds or so. We'll come back to you for your answer. Nathan, thanks a lot. And Tim and Jeremy, thank you very much for your thoughts for our TV viewers. Malika, thanks for dipping into all of the feedback. We're going to hear some more feedback from Malika, and we're going to hear more input from our guests in the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. For the TV show, don't forget tomorrow we're doing Swaziland and the issue of bailouts in that country. Don't go away. Welcome back to the post show. We're talking opposition to Australia's proposed carbon tax, and those who are for it. It will tax $25, about 23 Australian dollars, a tax per tonne for the biggest emitters. It's one of the highest in the world. Tim Andrews, there was a question from Nathan just at the back end of the program. You've had some time to think about it. Go ahead.
Look,
Go ahead, Tim.
So can you just, what was the specifics of his question again?
Sure, I'll try to make it brief. So the emissions aren't priced. They're not included in market transactions. The best ideas for dealing with them came from the right: taxes, cap and trade. Why are those being rejected now?
I don't think, first of all, you can say that those ideas came from the right. So I think that's incorrect factually. But the thing is, why these ideas incorrect is that I don't think that there's been sufficient look at, what's the opportunity costs here? If we're spending money on a carbon tax and carbon subsidies right now, what else aren't we spending money on? And this is the whole idea about,
That's the Bjorn Lomborg argument against it. That's a good argument, but that's different from what I'm asking.
You're asking why it was a good idea.
No, I'm saying what policy do you... I'm saying, what policy do you want to reduce emissions if they're not included in a market? I understand the opportunity cost argument. I think it's a really good one, but it's different from what I'm asking.
Look, first of all, what we need to do is work out whether or not direct action is necessary. There is the fact, by the way, I want to point out the fact that there are people on the right who don't believe that the climate is changing is a straw man argument. Everybody will agree, the climate is changing. It's a question of what degree carbon dioxide is responsible for this, what are the feedback loops, and so forth. So I'm just prefacing it with that. Having said that, there is legitimate debate as to the extent of carbon contributions contributing to this, and as to how bad it'll become. Jeremy said, if we act now, it'll be devastating, I think was his word. I don't think that's the case, and I think there is legitimate debate about this. And I think before action is taken, there needs to be a decent, cost-benefit analysis where it'll work out the costs of acting versus the costs of non-acting. And I'm not talking about the Garneau review in Australia, which I think has been thoroughly discredited, which we could discuss at another point, but a decent way for it. Now, if there is a decision, to get back to your question, as to what to do, I think there are advantages to a carbon tax if it's done as part of a revenue-neutral system of tax cuts. So not as something which takes from one, gives to another, redistributes to big polluters. Through a series of tax cuts, tax incentives, that's preferable to the current system. A system of tax credits to companies, a system which generally reduces the size and the role of government and enables companies to be able to innovate and to drive things forward. That's the direction of future policy that I'll be looking at.
Okay, we've got the crux of that, and it's a fairly well-made argument. Malika?
Well, I'll pose a question to Jeremy. People say that if there is no climate problem, Sleepless NVA tweets, worst case scenario is people pay taxes. Best case scenario, there's a future for planet Earth. And then we have something, a tweet here from Dan Illick, who says, in my bracket personally, I will be paying an additional $300 per year. I'm happy about investing in renewable energy. I wonder, at the very least, amid all of the criticism about this, is this raising an awareness, a cultural consciousness about climate change in Australia?
Well, I think, yes, that's certainly the case, that it being passed through the lower house of the Australian Parliament will certainly raise awareness. And look, a comment that was made earlier in the show about the standing in the polls that Gillard had. I'm not a big Gillard supporter, let me make that clear. I think she's doing a bad job on the whole. But a comment that was made about 57% of people being opposed to this tax. Well, at the last election, there was a huge swing towards the Greens in Australian politics. 2/3 of the votes that went away from Labor went to the Greens. Now, that clearly says that there's a large group of people out there who are very concerned about this issue, and that has historically been the case.
Yeah, and of course, yes, 4 years ago, Kevin Rudd's tough climate and clean energy talk may have actually propelled him to becoming Prime Minister. No doubting all of that, but all I said was, when I quoted that poll, is to say the majority in black and white, 56% of people polled in that Nielsen poll were against this. That shows that a lot of people don't think it's a good idea.
Even that, yes. I don't know why that's decisive. If there is an emergency with the climate, which is what it is an emergency. It's one of the greatest threats that humanity faces. then I think that is very good grounds for imposing a tax that will not affect most people to anything like the kind of degree that is being made out. I think that's a very good reason to do it. And I think that's why we have politicians, is to take leadership on these sorts of issues. It's not like Gillard's going to war.
Right.
Well, which they're also
that's an interesting take on it. I mean, you're a glass half full man, Jeremy. I'll give you that. But it's been great talking to both of you, Jeremy Moss and Tim Andrews. Thanks a lot for joining us via Skype. It's a fascinating discussion, and I hope that we can discuss this at length at another point in the future. Thanks a lot, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it. That sort of wraps up the discussion over the carbon tax policy and the proposal in Australia. But Malika, there are some other stories that we're following, aren't we?
There are. We're reaching out to our community on Reddit, which is the social aggregation website, and we are putting a couple of stories that we're following out there for our viewers' feedback. The first is in Cuba. The Ladies in White have staged a march following the death of one of the co-founders of the group. They're political dissidents, and they're marching in defense of people they say are wrongly imprisoned in Cuba. And this is the first time since their founding that men joined the march. And over in Chile, the Interior Ministry has drafted a law to criminalize what it calls the occupation of both public and private spaces. And it's basically to stop, with the picture you see here on my screen, stop students. We've seen a lot of student protests earlier this year, to stop them from filling the streets.
Yeah, let's ask Nathan about this. I mean, we've had, Occupy Wall Street here, Occupy DC, Occupy everything, it seems, at this moment in time. Perhaps Chile trying to preempt any action in their country?
I mean, that's certainly what it sounds like, and it's hard to have good feelings about that when when a nominal democracy bans essentially public protest. I mean, I don't know the details behind this, but it doesn't sound good.
Yeah, it smells of a sort of authoritarianness.
That's exactly what it smells like.
Yeah, so we'll continue to follow that. Let us know. I mean, we might actually do a full show on that. You can vote it up or down on Reddit and send us your thoughts. We can build on it and expand on it. And there's one more, of course, my favorite sports involved, so we've got to include this one.
Exactly. Last but not least, Portuguese footballer Cristiano Ronaldo has begun to tweet on the microblogging website Weibo in Chinese. We don't know if he speaks Chinese, Mandarin, but he has begun to tweet, and he says it's to be closer to his Chinese fans.
Well, I was one of his biggest fans, and then he moved to Real Madrid from Manchester United, so I'm not that much of a fan anymore. However, he's still a genius, and I think that this could possibly be because Lionel Messi hit record numbers on Facebook with the amount of people that liked his page. So maybe Ronaldo is trying to compete with him, not just on the pitch, but off the pitch, Malika.
Could be.
Yeah, we'll have to check out his Facebook page as well to see how many fans he has compared to Lionel Messi. Okay, so don't forget that you could vote those up or down on Reddit, and you can give us your ideas. We can expand on it. You can give us other ideas. We want you to let us know what we should be covering. That's the whole point of the show. Nathan, thanks a lot for joining us. Did you enjoy it on the infamous orange couch?
It's a lot of pressure, but it's great.
But it was good that you posed some decent questions to the guests as well.
Yeah.
Did my job for me.
Right. All right. No, I don't think they really disagree all that much about the carbon tax. I think they really just disagree about how big of a problem carbon is.
Yeah, the nuances of how to go about it, I suppose.
Yeah, which is kind of it's kind of surprising, but maybe not so. If you hear enough people in this debate, it really comes down to the carbon.
Okay. Well, good to have you on the program. Hope to have you on the couch again in the not too distant future.
Sure, anytime.
Malika, great to have you on the couch as well. And tomorrow you'll be joined by the inimitable Derek Ashong. He'll be back in action. I'll be back in a few days' time. Malika and Derek will be talking Swaziland, issues of democracy, issues of a failing economy, bailouts, possible bailouts from the Middle East, and neighbors like South Africa as well. Do join us for that.